Karim Kattan is a writer and researcher. He holds a doctorate in comparative literature. His first collection of short stories was published in 2017, and his novel, also in French, is forthcoming in January 2021.
I think it's an unescapable fact of being a Palestinian writer, no matter how much one is willing to give importance to that word and that identity of Palestinian. So it's an unescapable fact that place will always resonate in a very powerful way. For a Palestinian writer will always write about space and place. I think it's really it's this fundamental absence that's at the root, I think, of a lot of writers' work.
And you see yourself as a Palestinian writer?
It depends. It depends of the. It really depends on who my audience is and who I'm talking with. So I was saying, for instance, if I'm doing a book reading in France, I'll always tend to emphasize the fact that I am a Palestinian writer. Whereas there are other circumstances where I'm very wary of defining myself by a nationality. But because Palestine is under such, Palestine and Palestinians are under such pressure of erasure and disappearance, sometimes whether you like it or not, you do have to define yourself like that.
Can I ask what the reception is when you identify as Palestinian? Let's say you said in France or in the West.
It's funny actually, because people always want you as a Palestinian to perform something of Palestine to them. Now, depending on who these people are and what their political convictions are, that performance is different. But I'm always expected as a Palestinian to perform and represent something of Palestine and something of a monolithic Palestine, which I always try as best as I can to deconstruct and to explain that I am a Palestinian writer, but I'm not the or a Palestinian voice. There are thousands and millions of Palestinian voices and lots of Palestinian writers who don't reduce whatever Palestine is to a single condition and a single body. But in general, this expectation of bringing like an authentic Palestinian being to the stage. Very often it's that expected of me.
It's really interesting, and I find that actually happens a lot in your work, and you actually talk about that. You talk about this sort of performance of heritage and performance of culture. And do you feel that you are aware immediately when you're having an interaction with someone and your sort of identity is called to presence, and you jump to the occasion by having to perform or deperform? Can you deperform?
That's a really interesting question, and that goes, I think, also, absolutely beyond Palestine, because I think it's something that a lot of us are confronted to. And you got, I think, to the root of the problem is, I think often you don't have the time or the awareness to realize what you're doing. And I know that often I will, whether I like it or not, I will perform because I won't realize that this is what is being asked of me and this is how I'm practically conditioned to respond. So there are often instances where after the fact, after the Q&A, I'm going to be like, what did I just do? Like, who was this person speaking like from me? So I try to be aware I'm aware of that in my writing proper, because the temporality of writing obviously is different, but in everything else, that a writer is expected to do, I'm much less. I mean, necessarily the exercise of the interview or the Q&A or the book reading are places where you're much more vulnerable and you have less time to just reflect. And you're always supposed, I feel at least that I'm always supposed to have answers, where in general I much rather prefer to say I don't know and stutter a bit and then disappear. But so yeah, you always go back to this ease of the performance because it's comfortable as well. Because I mean, I know how to do it, right? Like I know what it is, I know what it entails. It's fairly straightforward. So there's a comfort there that allows you to not actually answer questions in all their complexity, maybe.
Do you think that this is probably something that you've learned and you've honed and harnessed your whole life, and it probably has to do with operating in different languages and meaning different cultures as well? Do you feel that you have a sort of grasp of what it might be like not to have to take up this performance as a self and as a cultural self or whatever, in whatever scene or environment? Or do you feel that you can't really imagine what it would be like to not have to express yourself in that way? Would that be so foreign to you to have to sort of having conditioned yourself to be so subjective about yourself in public, if that makes sense?
Yeah, you're asking whether it's possible to unmask or not, basically. I'm not sure, but this only goes for me, obviously. I think this is it becomes a very individual process, and it depends very much also on the personalities of people. I can unmask in short bursts. This I manage, but like upholding an unmasked answers throughout a whole conversation is, I think, a challenge. And also, as you were saying, a challenge just in terms of languages, because writing, I'm comfortable in several languages. Speaking, I'm never comfortable in any one singular, unique language. So there's always this hesitation as well.
Do you think you know what people expect? I mean, in that case, how would you identify yourself as someone else seeing you, as this person who's expecting this performance of self?
Oh, I think I'm stumped by this question. It's a really interesting question, but I'm not even sure. I think it would be arrogant to pretend that I can guess what people as individuals could expect. But I know what people, for instance, the French, because I do a lot of my book readings and tours here in France, so I'm very familiar with the French as an audience, right? And so as a collective audience, I sort of can guess what the French expect of either a Palestinian or an Arab or any writer who hails from do we have a better phrase than global south? From those places, right? Like
it's the phrase today, I would say. Yeah.
so, so they have these
third world.
terrible. Well, precisely these are the expectations that a certain French audience would have. But beyond that, I think I'd be hard pressed to know what people expect. I don't even know what people actually expect from I mean, the exercise even of going to attend to listen to writers talk so orally about their work is not very, it's counterintuitive, and that's actually pretty interesting. So the whole exercise is always unsteady, right?
Can you tell us a little bit how you did come to have an audience?
Yeah, I'm actually located in a so wait, let's backtrack. So literature basically is an industry, and it's a pretty local industry in terms of how it's distributed. So what I mean by that is that I write in French and I write in English as well, and both these types of writings don't sort of officially communicate. So the literature industry in France and the audience in France is one thing, or in francophone countries is one thing, and in English speaking countries is another, and they're very hermetic one to the other. So how did I come to have an audience? I published my first book. It's a collection of short stories a couple of years ago. It's in French. All my published books proper are in French for now. So I published it 3 years ago. It's called Préliminaires pour un verger futur. And I published it with a Tunisian francophone publisher called Elizad. And this was like, I think my first main audience sprang from this book. And it sprang from this decentered place, right? Because publishing, francophone publishing, is extremely centralized in Paris. Most of the biggest publishers who have a real audience are in Paris, and then you have like a bunch of independent small presses, etc., that are all around France, and then you have a few francophone publishers that are based outside of France. So the whole audience also is determined by the fact that I chose to publish with a Tunisian, like this was really important to me, with a Tunisian editor
Right.
who publishes in French.
Publishing out of Tunisia.
Tunis.
Yeah, that's great. How did you get in touch?
Well, actually, funnily enough, and I was very lucky in this regard. Okay, back then I used to have Facebook and I used to write a lot of posts on Facebook. I don't know if that's still a thing, but I was very loud
Right.
and really annoying on Facebook. And at some point, the publisher actually read a couple of things I posted on the social media and contacted me and told me that if I was ever interested or had anything lying around or anything, they'd be happy to have a look at a manuscript and I could publish it with them. So they sort of contacted me, which is absolutely, it's very generous of the publisher. And to me, it points to a certain set of values and a curiosity and risk taking that they're willing to, risks they're willing to take. And yeah, I was super lucky in this regard that usually, you send your manuscripts to a bunch of publishers and wait a year, right? And everyone says no, and maybe perhaps you're lucky one day someone says maybe we'll have a look at it or something. So it didn't work like that, and I think in part because they're a small press and they are not based in Paris. They're not like based in the center of the francophone publishing world. They're willing to experiment, basically.
But they have, I presume, and they had an audience in France, in the center of the
absolutely,
world.
Yeah. They have an audience in France, but it's interesting because it just, you can't flip an industry, right? Like that would be wishful thinking, but it does flip. The books travel from Tunis to Paris, and not the other way around, and I love that. Like the books are made in Tunis also. Like that's amazing.
Yeah. It also serve some challenges as well for, everything from distribution to printing, shipping cost, customs, and to take that on as a publisher is
absolutely
very noble, I would say.
Yeah, it's very brave. It's even challenging in terms of, because I know there's a crisis in paper production in Tunis, so even just getting the paper is a challenge.
Okay. Yeah. And would you say that you're most comfortable writing a sort of creative, reflective nonfiction, or more academic nonfiction, or are you actually more comfortable in fiction? And is that something that we can see more from you in the coming period?
Yeah, I'm actually so. I mean, interestingly enough, if you look up the texts that I published online in English, you'd think that I'm most comfortable in like creative nonfiction uh, stuff, but I'm actually most comfortable in fiction. Um,
Okay.
but it's all, like there's a certain trepidation in writing fiction, and yeah, in the future, this past year, I've been writing a lot of short stories in English that are purely fictional, that are also usually at the intersection of something between like science fiction, magical realism, and horror or fantasy, like all of these things. Um,
Yeah.
so that's what I'm really like, that's at the heart, I think, of what I like to write and what I'm comfortable in writing. But it's true that my shorter pieces that are like available are more nonfiction. But this ties back to the question of performance. I mean, I never write something that I do not want to write, but there's also this idea that a Palestinian writer writing in a language other than Arabic first has access to nonfiction. First of all, has access to documentary writing, to the mode of testimony, right? He has to or she has to testify. That's their first role as a writer, which is totally untrue. But it's these texts are much more easily accepted and published than, and
Sought
sought
after
after.
and
Absolutely.
digested
No.
by the audience. Yeah. The the book that you published in 2017,
Mm.
right? The one that you're telling us about by Alizad. Um, it says that it's a set of a collection of 3 Palestinian love stories taking place in the past, present, and future. Each deals with vanished geographies and disrupted languages and explores the possibilities found within broken
Mm.
narratives. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and the collection, how it came to be, and maybe go into one of the stories, conflicts, or themes that is a really driving force for
Sure.
you?
So it's a collection of 3 rather long short stories. They're not novellas, but yeah, they're long short stories, whatever that means. Um, and each one of them is set in a, a different time. So there's one that's focused on the past, one that's focused on the present, and one that's focused on the future, or the time when the future or the time of myth and legend, something like that.
Okay.
And they're basically so. I tend to say love stories because Palestinian love stories because it's the easiest way to say it, but the shortest way to say it to formulate what these are about. But now, with the distance I have, because it's been a while and it feels like it's a book that was written by someone else, I came to see that there are 3 stories about couples that are failing because they don't manage to tell their own stories to each other. So it's really about like storytelling in intimacy, in a
Okay.
Palestinian context, because I mean, Palestine is at the source of all of their stories, right? So, for instance, the first story, the one that's most related to, uh, that's between a lot of brackets, but to the present,
Right.
it's called Yod, and it takes place in Gaza. It's not really stated when, but so, like you understand that it's sometime after 2014, so maybe 2015, something like that. And it's centered around these 2 Palestinian lovers, one assumes that the narrator, the other one is a he, and the narrator is probably a he, but can also be a she. Like, this is a bit ambiguous. But basically, they're from the West Bank, and they go spend like a lover's holiday in Gaza, which is absurd. Like, even the premise itself is absurd. This is an impossible thing to do. And they're basically just sitting around, lounging in their hotel room in Gaza and looking at the sea and talking and not managing to talk. And then that's it, right? Like the plot itself is that. And they're in this hotel room and they watch the sea and they talk and then they break up, obviously, and the story ends. And it's difficult to describe, but it's really about this one is really openly about this idea of lost languages and disrupted languages, and the fact that these two characters don't manage to, as persons, as individuals, but also as Palestinians, don't manage to communicate with themselves or with each other. And a lot of these three short stories are centered around this idea of failed communication, I think. Which is a writer's obsession, I think. I mean, in general, like, it's also, I think a lot of people write as a way to part of writing is also just an exercise in like exorcising misunderstanding, right? So I think that's a lot of what happens in this project.
Maybe that's where conflict, and which is essential for a narrative to some degree, inner conflict and conflict between characters. Maybe that's where it resonates the most or emanates the most, is in any sort of failed communication, whether it's a relationship or two groups in society or two forces, social forces, political forces.
Absolutely.
And how long did it take you to write those stories?
That was a pretty, I mean, I enjoyed that writing is a craft that can take a lot of time, and sometimes it can be pretty. This collection was written, I think, over a couple of months or so, which is really fast. It was an express process, but
right.
Like, again, I don't know if it's everyone's experience, but I realized that a lot of writing is, so obviously a lot of it is editing, a lot of it is writing stuff and then just destroying it back into shape. But a lot of it also happens in like outbursts writing. And this specific book was written in quite a short time. In fact, yeah.
Sometimes they come out just crystal clear, and everything you need to say has been waiting to be said, and it comes out in that right.
Exactly, absolutely. And it's as if it's been like just gestating or fermenting, and it just comes out like that. And other times it's such a slog. And
did you have endings to your stories before you spoke to the publisher?
No. I think I had I tend to operate based on like, I mean, it's not a method. It's just that I noticed that I do that. I don't start by plot. I sort of just start with a series of images and like colors and images basically that I have, and I start building the rest of a story around. Sometimes it's very, very extremely specific. I know that the Gaza story just started with, so the narrator actually also addresses his mother throughout the short story, who's not present, but he talks to her. And it started with just that thing where I wanted a narrator, like,
in second person.
When he talks to his mom, he talks in the second person, and he's very, like sulky and petulant in the way he talks to his mother. And I just had this voice that I wanted. That was it. Like I wanted this narrator being very petulant with a mother figure that they're talking to. And then the rest, I started writing from that, and then I got to the short story. So this time it was fast, but other times this process can be super long because you just have this very specific thing that you want to do, but it doesn't yield anything until sometimes years later you sort of block.
Right. Experience it firsthand or have a memory, and it strikes.
Absolutely.
You understand.
Exactly.
I've read that your PhD dissertation explores the emergence of the desert as a literary landscape in the Mediterranean region. Can you elaborate on that?
So this actually goes back to the question of place and the attention to place and landscape that is at the center of. I mean, that's important for my work and in general for a lot of Palestinians' work. So in my dissertation, I sort of explored how the what we call the desert is properly like in many ways is a European invention of the 18th and 19th centuries and was used as an object of knowledge and an object of aesthetics as a tool and a way of colonizing the southern regions of the Mediterranean.
How does that explain to us how that works, how that happens, how a landscape of some sort, symbolically perhaps or narratively can be used somehow to.
So actually, let me take just one specific example. There's lots of them, but just one out of that I find illustrates it pretty well. So in the 17th century, you have a French noble who travels to Egypt. His name is Le Vicomte de Volnay. And Volnay travels to Egypt at a time where it's not that, like, you don't have the Grand Tour or anything, so you don't have a lot of French people who travel to Egypt. It's before before Napoleon invaded Egypt, etc. So he just goes there, and he writes a sort of a travel book about Egypt. And one of his main points is that Egypt is this amazingly fertile land. It's beautiful, and that has this incredible, these incredible archaeological riches and this heritage that's absolutely stunning. That the Egyptians or whoever is ruling the Egyptians isn't managing to preserve or to exploit. So he goes to the desert and he's like, oh, wow, in the desert, the sand is actually protecting all the archaeological artifacts from the misuse that the Egyptians are likely to by like burying artifacts, etc. Like he really perceives the desert as a sort of time capsule that protects all the artifacts that are going to be in the desert, and so he describes this in a lengthy way, and then he starts saying, and he's one of the first Frenchmen who will say that. He's like, well, it's actually kind of a boon. We're lucky that the sand and the desert are protecting this, because one day a nation that loves and that values architectural and artistic heritage, such as France, will have the responsibility of invading Egypt to save Egypt's riches from the Egyptians.
And he makes this argument publicly?
And like very, it's very naturally in his writing. It's not even like, it's just because he's one of the first. So this becomes a real argument. But since he's one of the first, it's just like an offhand thing. Like he's like, oh, Egypt is very pretty, but also we should keep in mind that perhaps at some point the French should come to save Egyptian heritage.
And this creates sort of a wave of political
Yeah, so
feeling in that
when
direction.
Napoleon organizes the Egyptian campaign and invades Egypt, he brings with him, I think, hundreds of scientists and artists, etc. And they all, like, that's the thing, like, they use as a guide to Egypt Volney's writings. So they all go there having Volney in mind and his thoughts in mind. And then, the process of creating the Orient is always one of intertextuality. So the Europeans, they go to the Orient, whichever one it is, to verify what they've read in other texts that were written by other Europeans. So immediately when Volney does that, the writers and artists of Napoleon go to Egypt, and they themselves write things that will then be read by other writers who will also go to Egypt and read. Like, so it's this whole process that creates this reality of the desert as a colonial space.
And what happens when this happens? I mean, obviously policy might change after a wave of public support for certain causes. Of course, policy in the homeland of France and whatever might also change. But what also happens to the intellectual or cultural backbone of the society, such as the Egyptian society at the time, which obviously would have had some understanding that these things were being written, that their heritage was being discussed in France. I mean, did you find in your research any sort of archival material regarding that?
I didn't find material regarding that specifically, because what I was also interested in is how after, so there's a time jump here, but how around the time of decolonization and after decolonization, what do writers from these countries, which include, I mean, it doesn't include Palestine because it's still colonized, but like from Algeria, Egypt, etc., how do they themselves use the desert as a literary tool? And how do they sort of metabolize this European desert and use it themselves to answer to answer both to these colonial narratives and to answer the birth of new national narratives as well that come in the wake of decolonization. So in terms of these countries proper, I'm more interested. In the dissertation, I looked more into the 20th century and not so much the 19th century, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. And what have you found in the 20th century? Are there any authors or historians that came across that you think
Oh yeah, lots.
we would be interested in?
Who should I discuss?
How do you dig into the archive? How do you begin?
A lot of the writers I was interested in for this period were mostly, a lot of them were Algerian writers. Some of them writing in Arabic and others writing in French, because the Algerians also used French as a literary tool as well to answer the French colonial narrative, right? And one of my absolute favorite writers is Assia Djebar, who's an Algerian writer who wrote exclusively in French. I'm not even sure she spoke Arabic, actually, or wrote in Arabic. And Assia Djebar wrote, but so this is in the 90s, right? A beautiful book called Loin de Médine, so far from Medina. And it's a sort of fictional chronicle of like it's a series of stories, and even the narration itself is really interesting, that revolve around a group of women who are contemporary with the emergence of Islam. So either she chronicles lives of desert princesses in the Arabian Peninsula, or Bedouin rebels or people, women from Medina. Like it's focused on these women and the way they related to fictionally to the center and the periphery of power. And the center of power is Medina, and the periphery is usually the desert outside of the cities. And that's it's a fantastic novel, and it's extremely complex, and yeah, it's a good place to start reading about the complexities of what the desert as a literary tool is, I find. Because she uses it both
That's
to
really interesting.
address we're in the 90s, so this is we're in the midst of the Algerian civil war. But and this ties in
Okay.
back to the question of audience, who do you speak to? So she uses it both as a way to address this like engulfing fundamentalism that is destroying at that point Algeria, but in a way that's complex enough that she can't be recuperated by any like racist, supremacist, colonial European eyes. So she addresses both, let's say, French colonial appetites and fundamentalism. Like one doesn't preclude the other, and she manages this brilliantly by using the desert as a space of uh, subversion of narratives, basically.
Well, both sides seem to have their own myth-making
Absolutely.
process over the desert and over the people that are absorbed in that
Absolutely.
life experience. And so it is, in a sense, the political Islam that emerged, let's say, in the 20th century as well, on the backdrop of a kind of reckoning of the European Orientalist experience, perhaps, or almost certainly, there is a sort of
Absolutely.
relationship
Even,
between
yeah,
the
yeah.
two.
And you're very right about the fact that a lot of the myth making of both these forces is predicated around fantasies of the desert. Very differently, but they do share somehow this space. Mm, mm,
Absolutely, and collective memory. In in your short story, The Incident
mm.
with the White Sneakers, you you deal with the sneakers as a form of radiance, and tying them into a galactic world that by the end has all but disappeared, not to give it away. How does symbolism come to play in your writing? And with that specific story, why did you choose not to divulge more information from the character's perspective, maintaining that sort of distance within the allegory and the symbolism? Why did you not feel comfortable presenting events
Mm.
as they were, in a sense?
I mean, at a very basic level, like the sneakers embody childhood or something of that sort. And they're a roundabout way of telling the story because I think there's a certain amount of, I don't know what to call it, like bashfulness, modesty. I don't know, but this needed to be an indirect story because
Okay. Does modesty feel like a prerequisite for approaching these stories, at least until now?
in general, no, I don't think so. But I think for me, they do. And I think, I mean, that might be an easy way out, but I'm going to chalk this up to culture as well. Like, I mean, in general, culturally, I'm not comfortable in general with anything that's too autobiographical. Like that's really not my domain, and it's something that I enjoy reading but cannot write at all. Um, and if I do write it, it has to be like in these, I'm going to say, bite-sized, extremely indirect stories with several layers of voices and symbols to sort of hide, not to hide, I don't know if it's to hide, but to wrap the the raw emotional crux of the story. I don't think it should always be like that, but I
Right.
know that to me this felt naturally more comfortable, I guess. Yeah, I guess.
I recently read an article. I don't remember if it was recently published, but
Mm,
an article in 972 magazine asking, "Are we
mm,
not allowed to be Palestinian on Instagram?" Uh, you discussed the role superstars like Bella Hadid have on the ongoing conversation surrounding Palestine and the
mm,
experience of the Palestinian people. You speak often in your work on the erasure of the Palestinian narrative and the way in which objects and stories become the roots by which the Palestinian identity holds itself together, at least in
mm,
popular consciousness. You say, and I'm going to read a short quote, that Muhammad Hadid could have been born in Nazareth, Palestine, a few months after the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel, and that such a fact is recognized on official US documents is a testament to this flux and to the possibilities it can birth. His passport blurs the lines, disrupting not only history, but also current attempts at erasing and containing it. What is at stake is not merely the existence of a thing called Palestine. This most people might agree on to some extent, but also of the powerful political proposition it represents. Palestinians, especially women, who do not conform to the images that are expected of them, cause uproars. This explains why Bella Hadid's voice, unapologetically and fiercely Palestinian, resonates the way it does. The campaign to erase the Palestinian people, narratively speaking, which you also address in your writing on the Abraham Accords, is an efficient and brutal
mm.
mechanism of narrative control. Can you reflect on this?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about this Bella Hadid incident, and I mean, it's a purely performative incident, right? So she posted a picture of her dad's passport, and Instagram erased it, and then they apologized that they erased it. Like it's, I mean, it's Instagram politics in the end. But what was interesting about it is that, I mean,
Right.
when you talk about the Hadids in general, and or Bella specifically, when you're talking about people who are whose privilege is immense, right? They have access to both in terms of, I mean, money, power, reputation, outreach, everything. Like we're in another sphere of being in terms of influence. The fact that even within these spheres, there is an attempt at erasure is actually, I mean, it's a teachable moment. Like you're like, okay, like no Palestinian body, or rather like no Palestinian memory is shielded, no matter what the privilege is shielded from this ongoing erasure. Like there's nothing you can sort of obtain in life that will lift you above this like encroaching oblivion. Um,
Does this come in blows in a way? Does it come in waves of these sort of realizations that that is the case? And I feel like it's something that happens to Arabs, especially Arabs who maybe have a foot in both worlds, is this recognition of complete, let's say, even otherness because of that sort of emotional distance that comes to be when you've reconciled with the fact that there is a sort of imbalance in the sort of humanity in the way that perhaps you are perceived, or at least your stories or your heritage or your memory is perceived. Is this something that you effectively are perpetually dealing with? Or is this something that these moments, like the Hadid moment, which you say is such a powerful, profoundly performative moment, made completely for the internet generation? Does it come and just emerge in that moment and then sort of dissipate, and a balance sort of then again sort of persists
That's
or
an
emerges?
interesting question, because I think it also addresses the fact that anything that is ongoing and relentless becomes normal and normalized. So this ongoing erasure, I mean, just in order to survive, you have to accept it. Like, you have to. I mean, you end up like sort of accepting it as a fact that you deal with on the daily, but that's not particularly shocking. Like, that's just what happens when you're a Palestinian, and that's it. And then you get these micro events that bring it not only to, because they bring it to the fore of a much wider audience. So they make you also approach this, even as a Palestinian, you all of a sudden also see these this process through the eyes of an audience that's not necessarily familiar with Palestine or the history of Palestine.
Do you think that might be somewhat purposeful? That might be somewhat. That's not a coincidence. That seems like it sort of empowers the narrative of erasure to erase publicly on the global stage, in a way, almost like getting ahead of the game and sort of, just perpetuating the idea directly and
Can you
indirectly
elaborate on
somehow.
that?
Well, it would seem that in moments like this, where the world is watching and certain stories come to be, and people are paying attention, that there's is a sort of power dynamic that exists when, let's say, that story represents this politics of erasure, and what is seen as the conventional wisdom in that case is the erasure. And when that is substantiated publicly on the global stage, it reinforces to someone like you, who is experiencing it as a Palestinian and who has been experiencing a kind of shadow conflict on the fringes during normal times, and then it becomes part of the trend. It's like one of the top stories. Then your erasure is made public rather than your erasure is questioned.
That's yeah. I never thought actually about it in that sense. I think that's actually a very interesting outlook, and I'm actually interested in the fact that I never thought about it that way, because we're so hungry for exposure that any exposure is good. I don't mean it necessarily is good, but we take it at face value also as being positive, like as going against that narrative. And we're so like, yeah, hungry for voices and exposure of just the word Palestine. Like, there's this gratefulness that's completely, I mean, ridiculous. Right? I realize that, but still, that a lot of us feel when the word bursts out of the domains of like international policies and seeps into other realms, like the cultural realms or whatever, on a global stage, whatever that means.
This is interesting because you also have written about the Palestinian Museum in Birzeit, and you discuss the way in which Western reading of the incident of opening a museum with no objects, sort of leaving the people confounded as to how that might be permissible. You criticized the inability to view absence as a reclamation somehow, or as a presence. I'm just going to read something from your piece. You say, as the concept of Palestinian identity developed over the 20th century, we started instilling the objects of daily life with a meaning that was too great for them. Two things led us to do this. On the one hand, objects worked as proofs. As the idea that Palestinians never really existed started gaining ground in some circles, pre-1948 objects started acting as assertions. One will always proudly show a British Mandate passport reading Palestine, despite the fact that this was issued by another colonizing power. Objects had the power of ending the conversation. We were there. Objects cannot be disputed. On the other, they worked as keepsakes. They were the embodiment of memories. They bypassed narratives, written and oral, to allow for an immediate transmission of history. You go on to say, absence is the crucial feature of our Palestinianness. No matter who we are and how we end up being called, West Bank, Gaza, 1948 Palestinians, refugees inside or outside, diaspora kids, third-generation Americans, we all carry absence like a yoke. You call the Palestinian Museum with no objects, our exile made manifest. If absence is not a lack, then, in the case of Palestine, what does it represent to you? A statement?
I like to think that it's a possibility.
Presence?
I like to think that, I mean, in many ways, the Palestine is a black hole. Like it's this fundamental emptiness that drives a lot of us, and the way this emptiness is made manifest is very different according to people and their experiences and who they are, etc. But with this comes a certain sense of amplitude, of expansiveness, maybe of expansiveness of what it means to be Palestinian. And one of the things that has consistently surprised me about Palestinians, and I'm generalizing because this goes for any Palestinian that I've ever met anywhere, West Bank, wherever you want, like inside, outside, whatever, is the permissiveness, but in a positive sense, like of the acceptance of the fact that there's no like defining features. Also, of I mean, there are defining features, but a lot of people are Palestinians, and you don't have to prove. Like you don't have to prove your identity as a Palestinian. There's a real openness in terms of identity that Palestinians always show, and to me, especially today, like I feel that in a lot of ways, Palestine is such a great. I mean, there's a lot of problems in Palestinian society, a lot of them, but it's such a great illustration of what it can mean to be an extremely rooted yet open society, and an extremely rooted identity that is also always open to the other and to the world, right? Like and in this sense, it's always Palestine is sort of like perpetual, excitement, and that's one of the most amazing things about that, and about the fact that this absence is also a possibility. It's a constant possibility of change.
Do you feel that Mahmoud Darwish was one of the first to perhaps verbalize or formalize that concept, or is it something that runs deeper, maybe even
I don't know
historical?
enough to be able to state either way. Like I'm sure, I'd say Mahmoud Darwish probably was the first to formulate and verbalize that in on an international, I guess, stage, on like to much wider audience. But I also think it's something that runs really deeply in Palestinian transmission of history and self for at least 3 or 4 generations.
We've been talking about performance of self and the presence of absence and Palestinianness, and I know that you have a new work that you're working on. Why don't you tell us what we can look forward to from you in the coming period?
Yeah, so I have a novel in French that's coming out in January. It's called Le Palais des deux collines, so mm, the palace of the two hills or something like that. And I was thinking about it also in terms of this uh, what we started with, this idea of performing Palestine. It's a weird story. It's weirdly constructed. It's pretty experimental. I'm not sure how well it works in that regard, but anyway. And it basically deals with this Palestinian who lives in Europe and who moves back to his family's big house in a fictional village. And so this was written before the pandemic, but he sort of confines himself in this huge house, and he's confronted with his grandmother's ghost. And meanwhile, the West Bank is being sort of invaded by settlers, and he goes mad, pretty much. That's pretty much the plot. And in this confrontation between his grandmother and himself, he's the narrator, Faisal. They are two performances of what being Palestinian is. And as I was writing it, because I was writing it in French, I was like, oh, maybe this is way too specific. Like a French or French-speaking audience won't get what this is about because it's too complicated for people who are just looking to read stories about Palestine. It goes into like murky waters about these subjects, and you can't write about this in French because you don't have an audience for this. It has either to be in English or in Arabic, but not French. And it kept coming back, like nagging me, like, oh, but this is too murky, too obscure for this audience. Until I decided, and it sounds obvious like that, but it's really not. I decided that this was not a problem. Like that it was okay if this book didn't fit the audience expectations. And I'm just mentioning that because often we take it for granted that, I mean, a lot of people like to pretend that they write, but they don't write to be read by people, but you actually do. You want to be read by people. You want to be understood to an extent by whoever is reading you. And in this case, I was confronted to this litmus test where I was like, but there's no way I can make the story understandable by a French or Francophone audience. And sort of deciding that, well, it's okay. It might not be understandable, but it's entitled to exist as such, was a pretty curious but interesting evolution in the way I saw my work.
English is my native language, it's my mother tongue. It's probably the first language I spoke, but obviously it doesn't represent necessarily the entire history. And so for you, it's obviously the same. And perhaps that need to be understood, which every writer has, is made even more difficult when, functionally speaking, maybe you are misunderstood anyways because of where you're coming from. So to then need to be understood by that audience further complicates that sort of confrontation. And I think it's something that it seems a lot of perhaps editors or publishers that work within these distinct sort of cultures, Arabic to English, Arabic to French, should probably have an understanding of. And I wonder if there's enough of an understanding around that in order to sort of nurture from writers, an authentic process for them while maintaining their sort of digestibility in their audience, but maintaining that authenticity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're phrasing that exactly as I'm thinking it. And typically, I know that this was also allowed by the fact that my publisher is based in the Arab world.